The hospital thought she was just another quiet resident until the FBI walked through the sliding doors and asked for Captain Rowan Blake. That was the moment the lie cracked. Not because she was hiding from the law, but because some people can save everyone in the room except themselves. If you have ever buried who you really are just to survive, this story is going to hit harder than you expect. It started on a rain-slick night in Baltimore under fluorescent lights that made the trauma wing look cold enough to cut skin. Monitors pulsed. Gurneys rattled. A young doctor kept her head down, her hands steady, and her past locked behind a name that wasn't really hers. That rain-slick night in Baltimore had begun the way most dangerous nights do, with nothing on the surface that looked dangerous at all. At 11:07 p.m., the surgical wing at St. Catherine's Trauma Center hummed with its usual midnight rhythm. Fluorescent light washed the corridor in a hard white glow. The coffee in the residence lounge had been burning on the warmer so long it smelled almost medicinal. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor kept time with the building itself, steady and indifferent, like a clock no one could silence. Ava Carter stepped off the elevator with her scrub cap folded in one hand and her dark blonde hair still damp from the rain. Her locker key bit into her palm. She had a slim build, calm eyes, and the kind of face people forgot the second they looked away. That helped. It was one of the reasons she had chosen this city, this hospital, this version of her name. She paused outside the staff locker room just long enough to pull her hair into a tight knot. As she lifted both arms, the sleeve of her sweatshirt shifted and exposed the thin white line of an old scar along her forearm. She tugged the fabric back down before anyone could see. Inside, residents were changing, talking too loudly, trying to sound less tired than they were. The walls were lined with dented gray lockers and taped up call schedules. A television in the corner played a late-night weather report with the volume muted. On screen, a bright red storm band stretched over the harbor. Carter. She looked up. Dr. Michael Holloway stood in the doorway in navy scrubs and a white coat that still managed to look pressed at the end of a long day. He was the chief of trauma surgery at St. Catherine's, 53 years old, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, and so thoroughly in command of every room he entered that people adjusted their posture without realizing they had done it. He had spent nearly 3 decades building a reputation for precision speed and being right more often than anyone around him liked. In the 6 weeks since Ava had arrived, he had never once raised his voice to her. He had never needed to. His restraint did the work for him. "You're on surgical overflow tonight," he said. "Yes, sir. Try not to disappear." There was no smile on his face. The comment landed in the room with enough edge that 2 interns by the sinks looked up, then quickly looked away. Ava slipped her sweatshirt into the locker and shut the metal door. "I won't." Holloway studied her for 1 beat too long, as if waiting for more. When none came, he moved on. That was usually how it went. At St. Catherine's, Ava. Carter was a question mark with paperwork attached. Transfer resident. Civilian fast-track qualification program. A sparse background file. A recommendation letter that was technically strong but emotionally blank. No family listed locally. No social habits anyone had noticed. She arrived on time, worked quietly, volunteered for unpleasant shifts, and never joined the loose circles of people who complained together after rounds. Hospitals ran on gossip the way trauma bays ran on oxygen. It filled every empty space. By her 2nd week, people had already built versions of her. Maybe she had flamed out somewhere else. Maybe she had family money and no stamina. Maybe she had done locum work in some tiny clinic and slipped into the program through a back door nobody talked about. Maybe she just looked competent because she was quiet. Silence invited invention. Ava had learned that a long time ago. She crossed the hall into the residence lounge, where the assignment board hung beside the coffee station. Dry erase marker names filled the columns. 3 surgeries, 1 consult, 1 possible transfer from Mercy General if weather delayed transport to Hopkins. Dr. Elena Brooks stood in front of the board with a tablet tucked under one arm and a pen between her teeth. She was a third-year surgical resident, 32, from Annapolis, with observant brown eyes and the steady posture of someone who missed very little. Her auburn hair was pinned under a scrub cap, though several strands had escaped and curled near her temples from the humidity. She glanced over as Ava approached. "You got the overnight add-on." Ava read the schedule. Bay 2, laparoscopic appendectomy. Bay 4, inguinal hernia repair. Bay 1, laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Routine, stable. No anticipated complications. "Lucky you," came a voice from the coffee station. Dr. Connor Wells leaned back against the counter holding a paper cup and all the confidence of a man who had never once mistaken his arrogance for charm. He was a second-year resident with good hair, expensive running shoes, and the permanent look of someone narrating his own career as it happened. "Gallbladder case in Bay 1, he said. "Perfect for a transfer. No thinking required." A couple of the others laughed softly. Ava kept her eyes on the board. Connor took a sip of coffee. "Where was it again? Tulsa, Omaha." "Richmond," she said. He raised his brows. "Right, community program." "It was a surgical transition placement," Ava said. "Sure." Elena pulled the pen from her mouth. "Connor, go make yourself useful." "I am useful. You're leaning." He grinned at her but stepped aside. Holloway entered a moment later with 2 charts in hand. Conversation thinned at once. "Wells, you're in Bay 2. Connor straightened. "Yes, sir." "Hernia case stays with me in Bay 4. Brooks, you supervise Carter in Bay 1. Procedure should be clean and fast." Elena nodded. "Got it." Holloway glanced at Ava. "This is not a proving ground. Follow the sequence. Stay inside the plan. If Brooks tells you to retract, you retract." "Yes, sir." He turned to the others. "Anesthesia has already cleared all 3. We're behind 23 minutes, so I would appreciate competence." He moved away without waiting for a response. Connor waited until Holloway was out of earshot, then exhaled through his nose. "He really likes you." Ava picked up the chart for Bay 1. "Don't take it personally," Elena said quietly as they headed toward the pre-op. "He does that with everyone he hasn't figured out yet." "I'm not taking it personally." Elena glanced at her profile. That sounded personal. It wasn't. Okay. They turned into the prep corridor, where the floor smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet wool from coats shaken dry at the entrance downstairs. A nurse wheeled a supply cart past them and pushed through double doors with her hip. Elena spoke again more casually now. "You don't talk much. Usually I'm working." "That is a deflection." Ava lifted the patient chart. "And this is reading." Elena smiled despite herself. "Where did you really train?" Ava opened the chart as they walked. "I told you, Richmond." "No, I mean before that." "There wasn't a before that worth discussing. People keep saying you came out of nowhere. People get bored on night shift." Elena studied her for another second, then let it go. For now, Bay 1 was prepped and waiting. The patient was a 46-year-old school administrator named Melissa Conway. According to the chart she had presented 6 hours earlier with right upper quadrant pain, nausea, and intermittent vomiting. Ultrasound showed gallstones and gallbladder wall thickening. White count slightly elevated, but not enough to panic anyone. Mild tenderness. Afebrile on intake. Pain worsening. Surgical consult approved. Routine if you trusted the paper. Ava did not always trust paper. Inside the pre-op bay, Melissa lay under warm blankets with an IV in her hand, and fear sharpening the lines around her mouth. Her husband sat in the chair beside the bed in office clothes, gone rumpled from too many hours of waiting. He stood when the 2 doctors entered. "Elena Brooks." Elena said, extending a hand. "I'm one of the surgical residents assisting tonight. This is Dr. Carter." Melissa looked at Ava. "You're very young." Ava had heard versions of that sentence for years. It had never once helped anyone. "I'm old enough to take good care of you," she said. Something in the calm way she said it eased Melissa's shoulders a fraction. Elena reviewed the consent, the risks, the standard timeline, the possible need to convert to an open procedure, if visualization was poor or anatomy was complicated. The husband nodded at all the right moments, though his eyes kept drifting back to his wife's face. Ava stood at the foot of the bed reading the chart again. Blood pressure, fine. Heart rate, slightly fast. Temperature, 99.1. White count, 11,000. Ultrasound, stones, thickening, no free fluid noted. No major red flags in isolation. And still something itched at the back of her mind. Melissa shifted under the blanket and winced before the movement was even complete. Not dramatic, just quick and involuntary. Her breathing caught high in her chest. "How long has the pain been this bad?" Ava asked. Melissa blinked at her. "Since this afternoon, maybe worse around dinner." It got sharper. Sharper how? Like something split open in there. She looked embarrassed the instant she said it. "That probably sounds stupid. It doesn't." Elena looked up from the consent form. "Pain can flare when the gallbladder spasms." Melissa nodded, as if that made sense. Her husband latched onto the explanation immediately. "See, okay, that's what it is." Ava stepped closer to the bed. "Mrs. Conway, have you felt feverish?" "A little. I thought it was nerves." "Any chills?" "Maybe." Elena gave Ava a quick look. It was not annoyance exactly, more like a note being made. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Scott Mercer, entered with a clipboard and a tired but pleasant face. He introduced himself, checked the IV, reviewed allergies, and ran through his own list of questions. While he spoke, Ava watched Melissa's abdomen rise and fall under the blanket. The rise was shallow, guarded. Mercer moved to the monitor. "Vitals are acceptable." Ava looked at Melissa again. There was a dull shine across her forehead, a whisper of sweat that seemed out of place in a room that cold. Then she smelled it. Not strongly. Not enough that anyone else would necessarily catch it beneath antiseptic soap sterile packaging and the stale breath of recycled hospital air. But it was there, a sourness under everything else. Not rot exactly, not yet. Contamination. The memory hit with such force that for one strange second, Baltimore disappeared. Not fluorescent lights now, but khaki canvas snapping in wind. Not the soft, mechanical beeping of a monitor, but rotor wash and shouting. Not a patient under warm blankets in a climate-controlled bay, but a teenage boy on a field cot south of Jalalabad. Belly rigid, pulse fading. Everybody insisting it was dehydration until the smell told the truth his skin had not yet learned how to show. Ava blinked once and the corridor came back. "Dr. Brooks," she said quietly. Elena looked over. "I think we should repeat imaging before we take her up." Mercer paused in the middle of his charting. Melissa's husband looked from one face to the other. Elena kept her voice even. "Why?" "The abdominal distension is more than I'd expect for uncomplicated cholecystitis. It's mild. There's a smell." Mercer almost smiled. A smell. Ava ignored him. "And her pain response doesn't track cleanly with the chart." Melissa frowned. "Is something wrong?" Elena stepped closer to the bed at once. "We're just being thorough." Ava held Melissa's gaze. "Have you felt pain anywhere else besides the right side?" Melissa hesitated. "Kind of all over now. It started here." She touched her right upper abdomen. Then it felt bigger. Her husband leaned forward. "No one said that before." "I didn't know if it mattered." Ava looked at Elena. "I want a CT with contrast." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in disbelief, in calculation. Her ultrasound already confirmed stones. Labs aren't alarming. Not alarming is not the same thing as reassuring. Mercer checked the monitor again. "She's stable. So was my last patient, who ruptured 20 minutes after a clean scan." That got Elena's full attention. "Where was that?" Ava was silent for just half a beat too long. "Richmond." Elena knew that wasn't the real answer. Her expression said so. "Mrs. Conway," she said gently, "we may do one more check before surgery. Just give us a minute." She motioned Ava into the hallway. The curtain swished shut behind them. Elena kept her voice low. "Talk to me. I don't like the presentation. You're basing that on a smell and a feeling. I'm basing it on pattern recognition." "From where?" Ava did not answer. Elena folded her arms. You know how this looks, right? You are 6 weeks into a transfer. Holloway already thinks you are all edges and no context. If we delay a booked room on instinct and the scan is clean, he's going to tear us apart. If we take her upstairs and she's septic, he can tear me apart after she survives. Elena's eyes stayed on hers. Something had changed in them. The easy curiosity from earlier was gone. In its place was a more careful kind of attention, the kind doctors gave to a lab value that refused to fit the rest of the case. Stay here, Elena said. She disappeared down the corridor toward the OR desk. Ava stood alone outside the curtain, staring at the floor as a transport orderly rattled past with an empty gurney. Her pulse was steady. Her breathing was steady. The thing inside her that read rooms, wounds, weather, and people had gone rigid as wire. This was always the moment that made civilian hospitals feel strange to her. In war, uncertainty moved fast. You learned to respect what your body knew before your mind could translate it. Hesitation killed with a kind of bureaucracy all its own. Nobody called it intuition out there. Nobody dismissed it as a hunch. If a medic with blood on his gloves said a man was crashing, people moved. Here, everything needed a document. Holloway arrived less than 2 minutes later. He came down the hall with Elena at his shoulder, chart in hand, expression already sharpened by irritation. Connor trailed behind them because, like most residents in every hospital on Earth, he was magnetized toward conflict. What exactly are we delaying? Holloway asked. Elena chose her words carefully. Dr. Carter thinks the patient may have a more complicated abdominal process than the ultrasound suggests. Holloway looked at Ava. On what basis? Diffuse pain. Distension. A slight odor, borderline vitals. I'm concerned about a developing perforation or early peritonitis. Connor let out the smallest possible sound through his nose, almost a laugh. Holloway did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Ava. A slight odor. Yes, sir. Anything else? She looks wrong. There it was. The weakest sentence in medicine and the truest. Holloway's jaw shifted once. You understand, that is not chartable. I understand. Then, let me be very clear about what I'm asking. Are you recommending that I pull a booked room, tie up CT at midnight, and delay surgery on a stable patient because you think she looks wrong? Ava met his gaze. Yes, sir. Silence held for a moment in the corridor. Even Connor stopped pretending not to listen. Holloway stepped past Ava and entered the bay. He examined Melissa himself, palpated the abdomen, asked several direct questions, reviewed the labs, looked at the monitor, and then read through the imaging summary with the kind of ruthless concentration that had made him famous. Melissa's husband watched every movement like it might contain prophecy. At last, Holloway handed the chart back to Elena. Proceed as scheduled. Ava felt something cold settle through her chest. Sir, she said. He turned. She needs another scan. No, she needs surgery for an inflamed gallbladder before it worsens. With respect, I do not think that is all this is. With respect, he said, and there was no respect in it, you are confusing discomfort with diagnosis. Elena glanced between them. Ava said nothing. Holloway lowered his voice. That made it worse. You came here with an unusual background and a file that answers nothing before anybody thinks to ask. I'm trying to give you room to prove you belong in this program. Do not mistake that for permission to improvise based on atmosphere. The words landed clean and hard. Melissa's husband looked frightened now, not of surgery, but of the doctors themselves. Ava's voice stayed level. I'm asking for confirmation, not improvisation, and I'm denying it. Holloway turned to Elena. Take the case. Carter assists only. No changes to plan without my direct approval. Yes, sir, Elena said. Holloway left the bay. Connor gave Ava a brief look that was almost delighted, as if humiliation were a form of entertainment. Then he jogged after Holloway toward the board. Mercer cleared his throat. Shall we? Elena touched Ava's elbow and guided her out into the hall again. You pushed as far as you could, she said quietly. Not far enough. There are politics here. There's a patient. Elena's mouth tightened. I know. A nurse stepped through the doors with a pre-op checklist. "We need to move." Elena nodded. Ava looked back through the curtain at Melissa Conway, at the blanket, the IV, the husband trying too hard to look calm. She had seen people on the edge of catastrophe wearing that exact same fragile stillness. The body knew before the chart did. It always knew. But she was 6 weeks into a program built on trust she had not earned under a name that protected her only as long as it remained small. If she forced the issue now demanded an attending override invoked every formal safeguard available, she could get the scan, and every eye in the building would turn toward her. That had consequences beyond a delayed surgery. Some names were safer when spoken softly. Some histories stayed buried only because nobody felt compelled to dig. She hated that she was calculating that while a patient waited. She hated that the calculation still existed inside her. Back in the locker room, she had told Holloway she would not disappear. The truth was more complicated than that. Disappearing had been the one skill that kept her breathing after she left the Army. She had learned how to file the edges off herself, how to sound ordinary, how to let louder people fill the air, how to answer exactly the question asked and not the one underneath it. Ava Carter was built from that discipline. Captain Rowan Blake had not been. Elena was reading the shift in her face. "You can still step out," she said quietly. "If you think you can't assist on this after that exchange, I can tell Holloway you were uncomfortable." Ava almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because in another life discomfort had never entered the triage decision tree. "I can assist," she said. Elena studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "Okay." They started toward scrub. On the way, a trauma nurse named Jillian Harris fell into step beside them with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Jillian had worked nights at St. Catherine's for 12 years and possessed the rare ability to move fast without ever appearing rushed. "You two are in Bay 1, she said, patients being wheeled up. "Elena's lead," Ava said. Jillian gave her a curious glance. "Heard there was a debate." "Hospitals love debates," Elena said. Jillian snorted softly. "Hospitals love watching smart people act territorial around the vulnerable." "True," Elena said. They passed the residence workroom where someone had taped up a comic drawing of Holloway as a medieval king guarding the OR schedule. Connor's laughter spilled from inside the room, then cut off when he saw Ava through the glass. She kept walking. In the scrub room outside Bay 1, warm water poured over her hands and wrists, while the clock above the sink ticked toward 11:38. The ritual calmed most people. The sequence, the order, the cleansing, the transformation from person to instrument. For Ava, it sometimes did the opposite. There were sink rooms in her memory that had no tile and no clock. Metal basins. Battery lamps. Water gone cold halfway through because generators failed. Scrubbing while the ground trembled from something detonating far enough away that nobody flinched. Scrubbing with blood already dried under the nails because there had not been time to breathe between one body and the next. She shut the memory down the way she always did. Hard and fast. Elena was scrubbing beside her, efficient and silent at first. Then, without looking over, she said, "I asked around about you." Ava rinsed soap from her fingers. "That seems healthy." "It is when somebody in my operating room moves like they've done this for 10 years, and their file says almost nothing. You found nothing useful. I found nothing complete." They stepped to separate sterile towels. Elena dried her hands, then held them out for the gown. "You know what bothered me most?" Ava slipped her arms into the sleeves of her own gown. "What?" "You weren't dramatic back there. If this were ego, I'd know what to do with it. But that wasn't ego. Number. What was it?" Ava pulled on her gloves with one precise snap at the wrist. "Concern. That is still not an answer. It's the one I have." Elena accepted that only because the doors were opening and the patient was already inside. Bay 1 was cold enough to raise goose flesh at the back of the neck. Overhead lights burned hot and bright above the table. Instrument trays gleamed under sterile wraps. The camera tower glowed blue beside the monitors. Melissa Conway lay under anesthesia, now draped and still transformed from frightened woman to surgical field with terrifying efficiency. Mercer stood at the head of the table, checking lines. "We're good to go." The circulating nurse read off the formal timeout. Name, date of birth, procedure, allergies, confirmed. Everyone answered in turn. Ava took her place opposite Elena. From here, she could see only a narrow frame of exposed skin, the monitor, and Elena's eyes above her mask. Those eyes were calm, intelligent, and no longer dismissive. That was something. Mercer adjusted the vent settings. Stable pressure, good oxygenation. Jillian opened the laparoscopic instruments. Metal clicked softly against metal. The room settled into the familiar hush that came right before the first incision, that strange little pocket where the whole team leaned toward the same invisible line. Ava breathed once through her mask and smelled it again. Faint. Wrong. Elena noticed the change in her eyes. Still, Ava nodded. Elena did not answer. She looked at the monitor, then at the draped abdomen, then back at Ava. Outside, the OER footsteps moved quickly down the corridor. Somewhere farther off, an intercom announced a lab pickup on another floor. Rain tapped against the high windows of the surgical wing in a pattern so soft it almost sounded like static. Jillian placed the scalpel into Elena's waiting hand. The blade flashed under the lights, and Elena lowered it toward the skin. The blade kissed the skin and opened it with a neat, controlled line. Elena worked cleanly, her movements economical, her breathing unbroken behind the mask. Jillian passed the trocar. Mercer watched the monitor. The camera entered the image, flashed to life overhead, and for the first few seconds the case looked close enough to ordinary that even Ava felt the room begin to relax against its own will. Then Elena adjusted the angle. The gallbladder came into view. It was not inflamed. It was dying. The tissue was dark in patches slick with bile and a shine that did not belong in a clean field. A thin streak of cloudy fluid tracked along the surrounding tissue. Elena froze not from fear, but from the brutal instant in which a brain recalculates and understands it was standing on the wrong map. "Oh God," she said under her breath. Ava had already leaned toward the monitor. The smell hit full force now, sharp and sour beneath the filtered air. "Convert," she said. Elena did not move. "Convert now." Mercer looked up from the head of the table. "Pressure is softening." How soft. 98 over 58 and drifting. Ava's gloved hand was out before Jillian fully understood what she wanted. Scalpel. Elena's eyes snapped to her. "Wait, we need Holloway." Melissa's heart rate began to climb, the pulse brightening on the screen in quick, urgent spikes. "There's no time for him to walk down a hallway," Ava said. "That gallbladder is necrotic and she's contaminated. If it ruptures farther or the bowel is gone, she crashes on the table." Jillian was already reaching for the larger blade. Some people moved toward authority. Others moved toward certainty. Ava's voice had crossed that invisible line, and every nurse in the room felt it. Elena pressed the wall intercom with one hand. "Dr. Holloway to Bay 1. Emergency conversion. Bay 1, now." Mercer looked back at the monitor. "She's dropping, 92 systolic." Ava took the scalpel. Her voice stayed level, almost quiet. "Mercer, start broad-spectrum coverage. Piperacillin, tazobactam now. Get vancomycin hanging. Cross for blood." Mercer stared at her for a fraction too long, torn between protocol and the fact that the patient in front of him was changing faster than policy could. "Now," Ava said. He moved. Elena stepped back half an inch, not enough to surrender the lead, just enough to admit she had. "Open tray," she told Jillian. Sterile packaging ripped. Metal clattered softly into readiness. The room changed shape around urgency. Ava extended the incision in one smooth motion, then another. The cuts neither rushed nor tentative. She opened the abdomen with the kind of practiced speed that makes people understand experience before they understand identity. Purulent fluid rose immediately into the field. The smell turned unmistakable. "Jesus," Jillian breathed. "Suction," Ava said. Elena had already recovered enough to hand it to her. Ava took it without looking. Her eyes were on the wound, on the color of the tissue, on the exact rhythm of Melissa's decline. Infection shimmered across the peritoneal cavity in ugly streaks. The gallbladder wall was failing. Near the hepatic flexure tissue looked angry and friable where it should have looked quiet. Contained perforation, Ava said. Possibly bowel involvement. Hold retraction here. Elena obeyed before she consciously registered that she was obeying. Mercer called from the head of the bed. 86/50. Heart rate 110. Push fluids. Start the blood when it gets here. Tell pharmacy I want pressors close. Mercer did not argue again. The door slammed open, and Holloway came in at a near run, cap still half-tied from another room, Connor close behind him, until one look from Jillian stopped him dead at the threshold. Holloway took in the field in one glance, and the blood left his face. What happened? Gangrenous cholecystitis with gross contamination, Ava said. She did not look up. Likely perforated in the last several hours. There's infected fluid tracking along the right side and possible bowel involvement. Holloway stepped in beside Elena. His eyes went from the field to Ava's hands and back again. Who authorized the conversion? Ava clamped a bleeder, tied it off, and shifted deeper. The patient did when she started to die. Holloway said nothing. Mercer broke the silence. Pressure bottomed at 84 and is coming back slowly. Antibiotics are running. Ava isolated the necrotic gallbladder with swift, precise dissection. Her fingers and instruments moved as if the anatomy had announced itself to her before the wound was opened. There was no waste in her, no hesitation, no visible sign of the pressure everyone else in the room was now carrying in their shoulders. She had worked in worse light than this. She had worked with less oxygen, less blood, less time, and the steady knowledge that if the walls failed, all of them would die together. Those memories did not come as thoughts. They came as alignment. The body remembering what to do when room-temperature air turns sharp with contamination and every second develops teeth. Clamp. Jillian passed it. Cut. Done. Suction lower. Elena adjusted. Holloway watched her technique with the stillness of a man who understood he was witnessing something that did not fit the file attached to it. The room had become hers without permission, not because she demanded it, because every choice she made solved the problem before anyone else had finished naming it. The gallbladder came free at last, blackened and partially collapsed. Ava dropped it into the specimen basin. Bowel, she said. The small perforation announced itself as soon as the field cleared, tucked near the hepatic flexure under a wash of contamination. Ava repaired it with interrupted mattress sutures laid down so quickly and evenly they looked measured by machine. Holloway's voice, when it finally came, was lower than before. Where did you learn that closure? Medical training. That is not standard civilian technique. It works. That is not an answer. Ava tied another knot. Then ask a better question. Elena looked sharply at her. In any other room that line might have detonated. In this one, it simply hung in the sterile air while everyone watched the pressure creep back upward on Melissa's monitor. Mercer read it off, almost surprised by it. 94/56. Coming around. Ava irrigated the cavity, checked for active bleeding, inspected the surrounding tissue twice, then once more, because the cost of missing something in a contaminated abdomen was paid later and paid badly. When she was satisfied, she began closing layer by layer as methodical enclosure as she had been in crisis. By the time she stepped back, Melissa Conway was alive for reasons no one in the room could comfortably file under luck. Jillian exhaled first. She had not realized she had been holding her breath. Elena stared at the closed incision as if she expected the truth about Ava to be written there. Holloway stripped off one glove, then the other. His gaze stayed on Ava's hands. Brooks finished skin closure. Elena blinked once as if surfacing. Yes, sir. Harris, recovery protocol for septic contamination. Mercer keep her and step down tonight. Mercer nodded. Holloway turned to Ava. With me. She removed her gloves and followed him into the corridor. The doors shut behind them with a hydraulic sigh, cutting off the brightness of the room. The hallway felt dimmer than it had 20 minutes earlier. Rain tracked silver down the high windows. Somewhere farther off, a phone rang 3 times and stopped. Holloway faced her beside the scrub sink. "That was extraordinary work," he said. The words did not sound like praise. They sounded like an accusation sharpened into fact. Ava said nothing. "You are listed as a transfer resident from a civilian transition track. First-year equivalent standing. Limited operative history. Sparse case logs. Yet you just converted a laparoscopic gallbladder case, managed septic contamination, repaired a bowel perforation, and closed like someone who has done it hundreds of times." Ava folded her cap into her hand. "The patient is alive." "That is not what I'm asking." "No, it never is." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Who are you, Dr. Carter?" The question sat between them, heavier than either of them let show. Before she could answer, the overhead speaker cracked to life. "Trauma alert. Multi-vehicle collision at Pratt and President. 4 incoming critical. ETA 3 minutes. Trauma teams to emergency receiving." The corridor moved all at once. A tech rushed past with a portable suction unit. 2 nurses came through the double doors wheeling blood warmers. The entire floor changed frequency, subtle and immediate, like a city hearing thunder before the storm reaches it. Holloway held Ava's gaze one moment longer. This conversation is not over. He strode toward the stairwell instead of waiting for the elevator. Ava stood where she was for one breath, then followed. The emergency department was already transforming by the time they hit the trauma level. Staff in navy and green moved under bright lights with the contained speed of people too trained to panic. Stretchers rolled into place. The trauma board, filled with names unknowns, approximated ages, and red markers. Rain blew in each time the ambulance bay doors opened. Dr. Miriam Shaw, the ER attending on nights, stood at the center station with a radio in one hand and a trauma shears clipped to her waistband. She was in her 40s, blunt, spoken, impossible to impress, and one of the few physicians in the building who never performed certainty she did not feel. "What do we have?" Holloway asked. 5-car pileup, Shaw said. Black ice on the overpass, and 1 truck jackknifed into traffic. 2 fatalities on scene. 4 red tags to us. 1 chest trauma, 1 pelvic crush, 1 probable head bleed, 1 elderly male with abdominal distension and pressure in the floor. Thoracic backup. 10 minutes out if the roads stay open. That means 20. Probably. The first gurney burst through the ambulance doors. The paramedic alongside it was soaked to the elbows and breathing hard through the report. Male 31 found trapped under steering column. Blunt chest trauma, decreased breath sounds on the left hypotensive and transport trachea starting to shift. Sat 85 on high flow. Tension pneumo, Ava said before anyone else did. Shaw pointed without looking at her. Bay 5, if you said it, you own it. The man on the gurney had gray skin under the blood and road grit. His eyes were half open, unfocused chest working hard against a body that could no longer move air where it needed to. Ava moved with the stretcher name. Daniel Reeve, the paramedic, said. 31, no known allergies. Daniel, Ava said, leaning into his line of sight. I'm Dr. Carter. Stay with me. His lips were blue at the edges. He tried to answer and got only a ragged breath. Jillian was suddenly there beside the bed with a tray. She had followed from the OR without anyone having to ask. Chest tube set. Ava listened once to the chest and heard almost nothing on the left. No time for imaging, she said. Prep him. Shaw was managing another arrival across the room, but her voice cut cleanly through the noise. Do it. A nurse exposed the left side of Daniel's chest. Betadine flashed brown across the skin. Ava found the 5th intercostal space by touch the landmarks arriving beneath her fingers with the clarity of a well-worn road. Lidocaine, scalpel, blunt dissection. A rush of trapped air burst against her glove and Daniel's body jerked as if the breath had returned ahead of him. Tube. Jillian passed it. Ava advanced, secured, and connected. The drainage system fluttered alive. Daniel's oxygen saturation began climbing before the dressing was even taped. 91, the nurse called out. 94. Color crept back into his face in thin, fragile strokes. Shaw looked over once, from 2 bays away, took in the placement and the monitor, and gave Ava the smallest possible nod before turning back to her own patient. The second critical arrival was already crashing into Bay 3. Female, late 50s, unstable pelvis. Internal hemorrhage suspected. Connor had that one, and from the way his voice rose half a note with every order, the room around him could tell he was working harder to sound in control than he had hoped to. In Bay 2, Elena was with the head injury, one hand on the bed rail while she read the pupils and barked for neurosurgery. In Bay 1, Holloway took the elderly male with the distended abdomen. Then the fourth red tag came through. A young man in marine physical training gear chest, wrapped in blood-soaked field dressings dog tags still around his neck. The medic beside him shouted over the noise. Lieutenant Noah Briggs. Off duty. Driver side impact followed by secondary crush against barrier. Open chest trauma. Pressure 70 palp. Distended neck veins en route then flat. We decompressed right side in field, but he's still pouring out. Bay 4 Holloway called, with me. Ava had just finished securing Daniel's tube when she heard the report. Something in the medic's phrasing made her look up. Secondary crush. Right side decompression, still pouring out. The language was imprecise, but the rhythm of the injury was familiar enough to tighten every muscle along her spine. Holloway was already elbow-deep in Bay 4 by the time she got there. Briggs had blood at the corner of his mouth and a pulse that looked temporary. The right side of his chest was a mess of bruising fractured mechanics and emergent intervention layered over trauma. Blood pooled faster than suction could manage. I need visualization, Holloway snapped. You need the source, Ava said. He did not look up. Then find it. She stepped opposite him and read the chest the way some people read weather fronts. Not one source. Not a major vessel rupture, not yet. The blood was coming in ugly sheets from multiple smaller tears tracking down and back, hidden by where gravity and rib fractures forced it to collect. Posterior intercostals, she said. At least 2, maybe 3. The field decompression bought him a minute, not a fix. Holloway's eyes cut to hers. How do you know that? Because that pattern is lying to you. The words came out flat and certain. The monitor screamed as Briggs's pressure dropped again. Holloway made the only choice left to him. Show me. Ava reached in. The first vessel declared itself under her fingers before it fully declared itself visually. She clamped it. Blood loss slowed but did not stop. Retract here, she said. Holloway shifted without argument. The second bleeder came off a torn branch lying deeper against the posterior chest wall. She tied it cleanly. Suction cleared. The third had been feeding the pooled blood around the diaphragm, half hidden under debris and dark. There, she said. Holloway saw it at the same instant and moved with her. Between them the field stabilized. Pressure rising, anesthesia called. Briggs' monitor softened from panic to possibility. For one suspended moment the room went quiet except for the machine breathing for him. Holloway stepped back enough to look at Ava directly. There was blood on the front of her gown, on the backs of both gloves, on the collar of her scrub top where a mist had reached skin. She looked as if she belonged there. That was the problem. That was exactly the problem. He finished the repair with her, but from then on the lead in the room felt shared in a way nobody would have predicted an hour earlier. When Briggs was finally stable enough for the ICU team to take over, Holloway stripped off his gloves and said, "Sit down." Ava was still standing. That was not a suggestion, he said. Only then did she register the burn in her shoulders and the thin shake beginning in her hands. Adrenaline always left by the side door. 1 second you were all steel and exactness. The next your body remembered it was built from flesh and fatigue and old damage. A stool appeared under her before she asked for one. Jillian again. Ava sat. Holloway looked at her for a long moment, then at the chart clipped to the bed, then back at her. Where did you train to read a chest like that? Ava wiped blood from the heel of one glove with sterile gauze, a lot of places. That answer's getting old. It's still true. Shaw entered Bay 4 just as transport rolled Briggs away. She scanned the room, the blood loss numbers, the repair notes, then settled her gaze on Ava. Your chest tube in 5 looks perfect on film. Good. And whatever happened in here just saved his life. Ava said nothing. Shaw was too practical to be offended by silence. Fine, stay available. Available. The word felt strange on this side of her life. For 2 years, she had tried to become unavailable to every version of herself that knew how to do these things. She had taken smaller jobs, civilian coursework, skills assessments, the long legal crawl back into hospital medicine under conditions that turned legend into paperwork and trauma into line items. Now, all of that had been blown open in one night by a rotting gallbladder and black ice on a Baltimore overpass. The department kept surging around her. Daniel Reeve in Bay 5 was pinker, now weak, but talking. The pelvic crush in Bay 3 was going upstairs with blood pouring through a rapid infuser, while Connor did his best not to drown in the complexity of it. The head bleed was en route to CT, with Elena beside the bed, giving a report crisp enough to hide her exhaustion. Holloway stood at the central station with one hand braced against the counter, scanning incoming notes, making choices, redistributing staff. He looked composed because that was part of his job. But every time his eyes passed over Ava, they sharpened. He had not forgotten the hall outside Bay 1. Neither had she. A trauma nurse handed her a fresh gown. You've got blood on this one. Ava stripped the old one off and pulled the new one over her shoulders. When she turned, Elena was there. For a second, neither spoke. Then Elena held out a bottle of water. You missed your chance to be unimpressive. Ava took the bottle. I've had a difficult night. Elena let out a short breath that might have become a laugh in any room less lit by catastrophe. You think? She leaned against the wall beside the supply cart, arms folded, eyes fixed on Ava, with the same unblinking intelligence she had carried into the OR. That bowel repair in Bay 1 wasn't learned in a civilian transition program. Number. That chest in Bay 4 wasn't guessed. Number. Elena nodded slowly as if confirming something to herself more than asking her. You've done trauma in places with fewer rules. Ava drank half the bottle before answering. Places with different priorities. That is the closest thing to honesty I've heard from you. A code bell rang down the hall, and both women turned by instinct, ready to move until a charge nurse shouted that it was respiratory on another unit and covered. Elena looked back at Ava. I'm not asking for your secrets. That's kind of you. I'm asking because whatever tonight is, it changes the fact pattern. Holloway is not going to let this go. Ava screwed the bottle cap back on. I know. Should I be worried? The question was quieter than the ones before it. Not about competence. About danger. About whether the mystery-wearing scrubs beside her carried consequences bigger than medicine. Ava met her eyes. Not for your patients. Elena held the gaze another beat, then gave one slow nod. That will have to do. They went back to work. By 1:30 in the morning, the worst of the collision had been absorbed into surgery imaging, or ICU. The department smelled of saline iodine coffee gone stale, and the metallic trace trauma leaves in the air long after the floors are mopped. Ava was writing a post-procedure note at a workstation near Bay 5 when Mercer drifted over from anesthesia, holding a paper cup. You order antibiotics like an attending, he said. She did not look up. Is that a complaint? It's an observation. She signed the note and moved to the next field. You followed the order. The patient was septic in front of me. Then you did the right thing. Mercer watched her for a moment. Have we met before? Number? You ever work military? The cursor blinked. Ava finished typing the sentence before answering. No. Mercer studied her profile and knew he was being lied to. He also knew enough about hospitals and about people to understand there are lies that protect vanity and lies that hold a person together at the seams. He sipped the coffee instead of pressing. At the far end of the department, Daniel Reeves' wife had arrived, soaked from the rain, her face wrecked by the kind of fear that strips a life down to one need. Ava watched through the glass as Jillian guided her to the bedside. Daniel reached for her with a hand still trembling from shock. His oxygen was steady. His chest tube sat secure. He was alive. Small evidence. Immediate evidence, the kind you could point to. It should have helped. Sometimes it did. Sometimes all it did was sharpen the memory of those who did not stay. She looked away and found Holloway already watching her from across the nurse's station. He crooked 2 fingers once. Office now would have been worse. Public hallway meant the conversation was still partly professional. That almost counted as mercy. Ava followed him into a side corridor outside radiology where staff traffic thinned enough for privacy without stillness. He folded his arms. I've spent 28 years in trauma surgery. I know the difference between talent and repetition. Talent is instinct with training. Repetition is muscle memory under pressure. You have both. Ava waited. You also have control that first-year residents do not possess. You don't crowd a wound. You don't chase panic. You don't speed up when the room speeds up. You slow everyone else down. Rain threaded the windows behind him in silver lines. He went on. Your chart says Richmond. Your body says somewhere else. Ava's expression did not change. I am asking one more time, he said. Where did you train? Her answer came quietly. In places where if I told the truth people either glorified it or misunderstood it. I'm not interested in either. That is not your decision alone when you're operating in my hospital. No, but what I do for your patients is, his jaw tightened. You are walking a very thin line. So are most people in this building tonight. For the first time since she had known him, something almost like anger flickered across his face and then vanished, replaced by a colder thing. Assessment. He was not deciding whether she was competent anymore. He was deciding what she meant. Before he could ask again, Jillian appeared at the corridor entrance. Dr. Holloway, Dr. Carter, both turned. Jillian held a new trauma chart in one hand. Walk in collapse in triage. Chest pain, neuro intact, blood pressure split between arms. Shaw wants a look. Holloway took the chart, scanned it, and frowned. Cardiac. Maybe vascular, Jillian said. Triage nurse didn't like the pulse quality. Holloway handed the chart to Ava. It was a small thing, a practical thing. Nothing ceremonial about it. But it was the first time all night he had put a case in her hands without first reminding her where she stood. Ava read the page once, then looked up. I want him in monitored assessment with immediate imaging available. Holloway nodded toward triage, then move. They entered together. The patient was a man in his late 40s in a soaked dress shirt, one hand pressed to the center of his chest, face gray with contained pain. His wife stood beside the wheelchair, gripping a handbag so hard the leather creased under her fingers. Ava knelt to his level. I'm Dr. Carter. Tell me where it hurts. He swallowed hard. Center, into my back, feels like something tearing. Holloway's eyes flicked to hers. She took the blood pressure herself in both arms. Not dramatic, not normal either. The right was higher. The left was wrong. The pulse told the same story. Ava looked at Holloway. I need the scanner. He was already calling for it. The patient's wife, hearing the change in all of them at once, began to ask if her husband was having a heart attack. Ava kept one hand on the wheelchair arm and spoke to her with a calm that felt borrowed from a different life. We're moving fast because it matters, she said. Stay with us. They rolled him out the wheels, thudding over the threshold, strip staff peeling aside to clear the route. Holloway moved at the head. Ava at the side. Jillian behind them, hanging fluids and speaking in clipped updates into the radio. For a brief second, passing the trauma bay doors, Ava caught her reflection in the narrow wired glass. Blue scrubs, hair pinned back tight, a face sharpened by fatigue. Blood on the side of her neck she had missed when changing gowns. Not Ava Carter entirely, not Rowan Blake fully either. Somewhere, uncomfortably in between. She looked away and kept walking. The scanner doors were already open by the time they reached radiology. The patient's name was Michael Denton, 48, sales manager. Hypertension untreated for almost a year because he had been too busy, too tired, too sure there would be time to deal with it later. His wife kept pace beside the bed until a nurse gently stopped her at the threshold. "I need to stay with him. You need to let us move," Ava said, and her voice carried enough calm to make obedience feel possible. "I'll come back out and talk to you." Michael gripped the rail with whitening fingers. Sweat stood on his upper lip. The pain had changed. His breathing made each inhale shallow and guarded. "It feels wrong," he said. Ava nodded once. "I know." They transferred him onto the scanner table. Holloway stood at the foot reading the chart again, even though the numbers had already moved from possibility to probability in his mind. Jillian hung another line. The text slid Michael into position. Die ran. Images appeared one slice at a time on the screen. The room went quiet. The radiologist leaned closer, then straightened in a hurry. There. Small descending tear. Early dissection. Michael's wife heard the shift in tone from the hallway and went still on the other side of the glass. Holloway did not look at Ava right away. When he finally did, the acknowledgement in his face was clear enough to feel like impact. "Call vascular now," he said. A resident at the workstation started dialing before he finished the sentence. Ava moved back out into the hall where Michael's wife stood with both hands over her mouth. The fluorescent light made her look too pale, almost translucent. "What is it?" "A tear in the aorta," Ava said. "We found it before it ruptured. He needs surgery, and we are moving fast." The woman's eyes filled at once, not because of the bad news alone, but because someone had finally named the thing her body had already sensed. "Is he going to live?" Ava held her gaze. "We got to it in time. That did not promise everything. It promised enough." The wife pressed her hand to her own sternum, as if pain might jump bodies if she stood close enough. "Thank you for listening." Ava nodded and stepped aside as vascular surgery arrived at a run. When Michael Denton rolled away toward the OR, our Holloway stayed behind in the corridor just long enough for the rest of the team to clear. Rain streaked the windows at the far end. The overhead lights buzzed softly. "You were right again," he said. Ava said nothing. "That is becoming statistically offensive." It was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him all night. It vanished almost as soon as it appeared. He folded the chart in half against his palm. "You are either the most unusual transfer resident I have ever seen, or you have not told this hospital who it hired. I told the board what was required. That is not the same thing. Number." He watched her for one beat, then another. "When this shift slows down, you and I are going to finish that conversation." Before she could answer, the overhead speaker cracked across the department. "Mass casualty alert. Structural collapse at Harbor Point redevelopment site. Multiple injuries inbound. Estimated arrival 5 minutes. All trauma teams report." The entire floor changed shape. A calm emergency department was still a machine. A mass casualty event turned it into weather. Shaw's voice cut through the noise before the intercom finished. "Clear the hallway. Open all available bays, call blood bank and activate surge." Nurses moved at a run. Techs stripped clean beds and wheeled crash carts into position. The trauma board was erased and filled again in one violent rush of marker. Outside the ambulance doors, rotating lights strobed red and blue through the rain. Elena appeared from the ICU side of the unit, pulling a fresh scrub cap over her hair. "How many?" "No one knows yet," Jillian said. Scaffolding came down onto a concrete pour. Maybe 12. Maybe more. Connor Wells came out of a supply room, carrying chest tube trays, his face pale enough that even his confidence could not fully disguise it. "Please tell me this is an exaggeration." Shaw did not look up. No. Holloway took command at the center station with the kind of authority that compresses chaos into lanes. Shaw, you triage. Brooks airway and neuro. Wells ortho overflow. Carter with me for penetrating chest or abdominal until we know what's coming. Harris, float where she's needed most. No one questioned the assignment. That landed harder than praise would have. The first ambulance hit the bay doors less than 4 minutes later. A paramedic jumped down from the back rain glistening on his jacket. Male 34, crush injury pelvis, and both lower extremities pressure 80/40, active hemorrhage tourniquet left leg. Bay 2 swallowed the stretcher. The second rig rolled in behind it. Female 28, blunt head trauma, unequal pupils. Possible epidural decreasing responsiveness. Bay 3. The third arrival came so fast the reports overlapped. Male unknown age. Thoracic impalement from steel rod. Unstable diminished right breath sounds bleeding controlled only by the object. Holloway and Ava were already moving. The patient was young. Mid-20s maybe. Construction vest cut open. Rainwater mixed with blood across his chest and neck. A length of rebar shortened at the seam by rescue saws protruded below the right clavicle and disappeared into his upper chest at an angle that made every person around the bed instinctively want to reach for it, and none of them dare. His eyes were open wide with shock and effort. "What's your name?" Ava asked. "Luis." The word came out thin and wet. "Am I dying?" "Not here." The answer came before Holloway could approve it. He did not object. The monitor told the truth under the reassurance. Pressure falling. Heart racing. Oxygen low and dropping. Shaw leaned over from the next bay long enough to look. "He goes upstairs now, or he dies down here," or two Holloway said. "Call vascular and thoracic." A nurse shook her head. Thoracic is still on the road from east side and vascular is tied up with the dissection. Holloway looked once at the rebar, then at the pressure, then at Ava. Calculation moved across his face so quickly it barely qualified as expression. "I'll take him," Ava said. "You'll take him with me," Holloway replied. A monitor screamed from Bay 1. Another patient was crashing. Shaw pivoted toward the sound. "Noah Briggs from the collision is back from CT and circling the drain." Holloway. "I need you now, or I lose him." For the first time all night, Holloway's certainty fractured. He looked between the two lives in front of him, and for one terrible second, Ava saw the old battlefield equation bloom in the bright civilian corridor. Not who deserves the chance. Who has the chance if you choose fast enough. "I can take the impalement," Ava said. He turned to her. "Solo. With anesthesia, a scrub team, and any general instruments they can throw through the doors." That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters. Luis made a noise that could have become a scream if he had more air. Shaw snapped from the next bay. "Michael." Holloway's jaw locked. Ava did not soften her voice. "Either I move him now, or you can write time of death downstairs." He gave one sharp nod. "Take or two. Do not remove the rod until you see the track. I want updates every 5 minutes." She was already moving with the stretcher. The elevator ride to surgery lasted less than a minute and felt longer than some deployments. Luis lay under the harsh ceiling lights gasping around his pain. A nurse squeezed blood into the pressure bag. Another kept one hand braced against the cut end of the rebar so it would not shift with the movement of the car. "Stay with me," Ava said. He blinked at her. "My wife. Name. Marisol. We'll call her." He tried to nod and grimaced so hard his whole face changed shape. The doors opened. Or two was ready in the only way a room can ever be ready for catastrophe. Bright lights. Open trays. Drapes. Blood warming. The anesthesiologist introducing himself too quickly because names matter less than hands when the line between living and dying has narrowed to minutes. Ava scrubbed with the speed of long practice. Water ran over her hands and wrists while memory tried to overlay itself on the room again. Canvas. Diesel. Dust. The ground humming under distant impact. She shoved it back where it belonged. By the time she stepped to the table in sterile gown and gloves, Luis was intubated and sinking anyway. The rebar had entered beneath the clavicle and tracked down toward the chest. The angle was both terrible and merciful. A direct hit to the subclavian artery would likely have ended him before the ambulance left the site. This was slower than that, which meant fixable if she moved cleanly. "Knife," she said. The scrub tech placed it in her palm. She made the incision wide enough to see, not just to hope. Tissue opened, blood welled. The room narrowed to the path of steel inside flesh. Retractor. She followed the foreign body downward with her eyes and fingers building the anatomy in real time. Clavicle spared. Lung nicked. Vein torn. A pocket of blood where there should have been none. Not the artery, thank God. "Clamp ready," she said. The scrub tech passed it without question. A circulator answered the ringing room phone and held it out. "Dr. Holloway wants status." Ava never looked up. "Tell him track identified, subclavian artery intact, vein injury likely. I'm controlling before removal." The nurse relayed it, listened, then nodded. He said proceed. Luis's pressure slipped again. "Transfuse now," Ava said. The blood went in. She wrapped her left hand around the exposed rebar and looked once at the field. Timing mattered more than force. Pull too fast, and you tear what is holding. Pull too slowly, and you let it shear on the way out. "On my count," she said. The room held still. She removed the rod in one smooth, controlled motion. Blood flooded the field exactly as expected. Pressure. Her fingers found the torn vein before sight did. Warm blood sheeted over her glove and wrist. She compressed hard. The bleeding narrowed. Clamp. The first went on, then a second. Suction cleared the view. There it was, a clean enough tear to repair. Every motion after that felt less like invention than recollection. Stitch, tie, cut. Small laceration at the apex of the lung. Repair, irrigate, recheck. Nothing left behind. No arrogance. No mercy for what she might miss. The anesthesiologist called the numbers from the head of the bed. Pressure coming up. 84/50, now 92. The room exhaled with him. Ava closed the chest with the same steady speed. When she finally stepped back, the air inside the OR felt used up. She stripped off her gloves and looked at the clock. 21 minutes. Too long for a battlefield. A miracle for a civilian operating room in the middle of a city collapse. "Transfer to ICU when stable," she said. "Get a message to his wife as soon as registration finds her." The circulating nurse blinked at her as if only now remembering to react. "Doctor, that was—" Ava was already walking out. Back in the elevator, she leaned one shoulder against the steel wall and closed her eyes for one breath only. Fatigue had started to thread itself into her hands, into the base of her skull, into the old scar tissue around memory. She ignored all of it. The emergency department on the trauma floor looked less like a hospital now, and more like a command post under siege. Stretchers lined hallways. Wet footprints crossed every polished surface. Radios crackled. Someone shouted for O negative. Someone else shouted back that they were already on the way. Shaw saw Ava the instant the elevator doors opened. Or stable. Good. Bay 1. Noah Briggs was back on a trauma bed, his skin ash-pale ventilator hissing beside him. Holloway stood over the open chest with a look Ava had not seen on his face before. Not confusion. Recognition of a problem, refusing the answer he wanted. "He arrested twice in transport," Holloway said as she stepped in. "I've got blood in the chest and rhythm instability. Cardiac contusion, maybe more." Ava looked at the pattern. The bruising. The pooled blood. The fractured mechanics under the dressings. "No," she said. Holloway looked up sharply. "It's not the heart. Pressure is collapsing. The heart is the victim, not the source." She moved closer. "The posterior rib fractures are shredding the intercostals again. Blood is collecting low and compressing everything upward." He stared at her for half a heartbeat, then stepped aside just enough. "Show me." She did. Her hands entered the field with the same certainty that had unnerved him in Bay 4. Find the fracture line. Track the collection. Follow where blood wants to settle, not where panic wants to look. One vessel, then another, deep and ugly but reachable. Clamp, tie, suction. The field cleared. Anesthesia called out the first slight improvement, as if afraid to trust it. Then a second. Briggs's rhythm steadied into something that looked less borrowed. Holloway stared at the monitor, then at Ava, and for the first time all night he no longer looked merely suspicious. He looked confronted. When they finished, he stripped off his gloves and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Nobody learns that in Richmond. Number. Then where? A voice answered from the doorway before she could. Overseas. They both turned. A man in weather-stained camouflage stood just inside the trauma bay entrance, one sleeve darkened by rain boots wet from the ambulance floor. Mid-40s. Hard face. Old injury in the set of one shoulder. He had the bearing of someone who had once learned to scan every room for exits before entering it. A military medic patch was still visible on his bag where he had set it down by the wall. Shaw glanced over from the next bay. Who let him in here? He came in with one of the construction victims, Jillian said. Said he was helping with extrication. Former Army medic. The man did not look at anyone except Ava. Recognition moved across his face in slow, devastating certainty. No chance, he said softly. I knew it. Ava went very still. Holloway's eyes moved between them. You know Dr. Carter? The man took one step forward. Respect straightened his spine before he spoke. That isn't Dr. Carter. The room around them kept moving, but more quietly now. Even in an emergency department, certain tones make people listen without meaning to. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a weathered phone. His thumb crossed the screen twice, then stopped on a photograph. He held it out to Holloway. In the image, dust and heat had bleached the world down to sand-colored light. A field surgical tent. Stretchers, men in uniform, blood on the ground. And at the center, a younger woman in scrubs with her hair tied back, forearms red to the elbow, eyes fixed on something beyond the frame. Same face, same stillness under pressure. A name attached to it that Ava had not heard spoken aloud in a civilian hospital in 2 years. That's Captain Rowan Blake, the medic said. Army Rangers, Special Operations Medical. She worked out of Kandahar and Mosul. Everybody in my unit knew her name. No one spoke. Holloway took the phone and looked from the image to Ava, then back again. He did not seem startled now. He seemed like a man watching puzzle pieces lock into place against his will. The medic swallowed once. His voice roughened. She saved my leg and helmet after an IED put shrapnel through the artery. They told me later I was gone 3 times on the bird. She kept bringing me back. Ava could feel every eye in the bay without looking at any of them. Sergeant, she said quietly. The man's eyes flicked to her. Emotion tightened his face with painful speed. Staff Sergeant Dean Mercer. Retired now. She remembered him then. Not the rank. Not the name at first. The wound. The impossible amount of mud and blood. The way he had sworn at her when she cut the boot off because he thought it meant he was losing the leg. The way he had cried after surgery, furious at himself because he thought someone would hear. You lived, she said. A sad smile moved across his mouth. Because of you. Silence expanded through the room until it was almost visible. Holloway handed the phone back without taking his eyes off Ava. Captain Rowan Blake. She looked at Briggs on the bed instead of at him. His pressure was holding. He would live if nothing else failed before dawn. That was a different name, she said. Was it Holloway asked, or is Carter the different one? Shaw crossed the room at last, taking in the faces, the phone, the fractured rhythm of the bay. I need either an explanation or less drama. No one answered her immediately. Ava removed her gloves 1 finger at a time and dropped them into the bin. Blood marked the front of her gown. Fatigue pressed behind her eyes, now relentless and heavy. There are moments when exposure feels like violence. This was one of them, not because Mercer had meant harm, but because he had spoken into the one silence she had spent 2 years building. She met Holloway's stare. My patients are alive, she said. That is still the most relevant fact in this room. His expression hardened, but not in anger, more in refusal. He had crossed beyond curiosity now into obligation. That may not remain true if I cannot trust the person holding the scalpel. Ava's voice stayed level. Then judge my work. I am. I'm also judging the truth around it. Mercer looked from one to the other and realized too late what his gratitude had done. Sir, with respect, whatever name she's using, she's the reason 2 of your trauma patients are breathing. 3, Jillian said quietly from the far side of the bay. No one corrected her. Shaw rubbed one hand over her forehead. Can this wait until we're not drowning? A trauma alarm sounded in the next corridor, answering for them. Holloway looked at Ava one long second more. When he spoke, his tone was all command again, stripped clean of everything human that made the moment dangerous. Finish the shift, he said. Then my office. Ava nodded once. It was not agreement. It was acceptance of the fact that there was no room left to retreat into. Mercer stepped back toward the doorway, regret written all over his face. Captain. Not here, she said. He stopped at once. Yes, ma'am. She flinched at the rank more than she had at the name. Then Shaw was moving again. Jillian was calling for transport. Elena was shouting for a portable vent in Bay 3, and the department dragged them all back under the weight of immediate work. That was the mercy of medicine. It often denied people the time required to fall apart. Ava turned toward the next patient because there was nothing else to do. The shift dragged on for another 3 hours, in fragments of bloodlight and exhaustion. The structural collapse kept feeding the department in waves. A foreman with a ruptured spleen, a crane operator with bilateral wrist fractures and a skull laceration, a laborer coughing pink foam after concrete dust and blunt trauma turned his lungs into wet paper. Ava moved from bed to bed with the same stripped-down economy she had carried into every room that night. She intubated once, repacked a wound twice, talked a terrified 19-year-old apprentice through the pane of a chest film, while rain hammered the ambulance bay roof hard enough to sound like gravel. Nobody called her captain again. Nobody had to. The name was in the air now. Not spoken, just present. That was the thing about secrets in hospitals. Once they surfaced, they did not sink back into place. They spread through expression, through silence, through the sudden caution in other people's questions. By 4 a.m, the trauma board had finally begun to clear. Patients were in the OR, in imaging, in ICU, or stable enough to be handed to the floors. The emergency department still buzzed with low-grade motion, but the fever had broken. Ava stood at a sink near Bay 3, washing dried blood from the side of her neck, when Elena stepped up beside her. You have a line of scrubs in your locker that all look exactly the same, Elena said. Ava glanced at her in the mirror. That bothers you. It feels strategic. It is strategic. Elena folded her arms. The circles under her eyes had darkened, but her gaze was as sharp as ever. You could have told me. Ava turned off the water. Could have and should have are different things. That is not an apology. Number. Elena nodded once, accepting the bluntness for what it was. Do I need to worry about anything legal? Number. Anything dangerous? Ava dried her hands and set the towel aside. Only if somebody mistakes a biography for a threat. Elena studied her for a long moment. You know that is not reassuring. It is the truth. The overhead lights caught the faint old scar near Ava's forearm as she pushed her sleeve down. Elena noticed it and looked away just quickly enough to be polite. I read your chart when you came in, Elena said. There are people whose records are thin because they have done very little. Yours felt thin because someone had cut pieces out. Ava said nothing. Elena let out a tired breath. Holloway is in his office. 2 federal agents arrived 20 minutes ago and asked the charge desk where to find Captain Rowan Blake. Ava went still, not externally. The motionlessness had become too practiced for that. But something inside her tightened in one clean, merciless turn. Elena saw it happen anyway. I thought you should hear it from me first. Ava looked past her toward the central station. Holloway stood at the far end of the corridor with his back to the room, one hand on his hip, talking to Shaw, in a voice too low to hear. Jillian sorted medication trays nearby and kept glancing toward the elevator as if expecting more trouble to walk off it. FBI, Ava asked. Elena nodded. Suit and tie, Federal. They asked for you by your real name. Ava felt the old instinct wake at once. Exit route, stairwell, loading dock, garage camera angles, civilian clothes in locker 13, cash in the front pocket of the duffel she never left fully unpacked. She had not used that instinct in almost a year. The speed with which it returned made her feel briefly sick. She had spent 2 years building a life careful enough to look ordinary under fluorescent lights. Coursework, credentialing, interviews, rotations, quiet answers on forms. She had changed the name not illegally, just incompletely leaning on her mother's maiden name the way wounded people lean on walls when they still want to look upright. She had told herself she was not running, only reducing noise, only creating distance between now and the version of herself everyone else insisted on mythologizing. Distance had limits. Tonight had burned through all of them. Are they here to arrest you? Elena asked quietly. Ava looked at her. I don't know. It was the first fully honest answer she had given her all night. Holloway turned then and saw them. He gave Ava a short, unmistakable motion toward the hallway. She went. His office sat above the trauma level in the administrative wing, 1 floor removed from the noise but not from its aftershocks. The corridor outside it was lined with framed black and white photographs of old hospital expansions, ribbon-cutting, smiling board members long dead and still immortalized in polished wood. The quiet there always felt unnatural to Ava, like the silence inside a chapel built in the center of a battlefield. Holloway opened the office door and stood aside. Inside, she stepped through. 2 people sat across from his desk. A woman in a charcoal suit with silver threaded through dark hair pulled back at the nape of her neck. Early 40s, controlled posture, eyes that missed nothing and did not advertise what they found. Beside her, a younger man in a navy suit with a federal bearing not yet worn smooth by time. His tie was still perfectly centered at 5 in the morning. His expression carried the particular stiffness of someone who had learned professionalism before he had learned ease. The woman stood first. Captain Rowan Blake, she said. Not a question. Ava remained near the door. That is not the name I use here. The woman inclined her head a fraction. Special Agent Claire Donovan. This is Agent Ethan Cole. Cole stood but did not offer his hand. Holloway came around behind the desk and remained standing rather than sit. It made the room feel less like an office and more like an inquiry chamber with diplomas. You have my attention, Ava said. Donovan set a thin tablet on the desk and woke the screen with one touch. Former Army Captain Rowan Elise Blake. Ranger attached medical operations. 4 overseas deployments. Classified operational assignments in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Medical transition request filed 26 months ago. Discharge status incomplete pending final reserve review and security verification. Holloway's eyes shifted to Ava at the word incomplete. Ava kept her face still, and that brings the FBI to a civilian hospital at 5 in the morning. Donovan held her gaze. Your face was flagged during a routine interagency biometric match at a public institution. When an officer with your service profile surfaces under a civilian credentialing name before final review is closed, protocol requires direct confirmation. Cole spoke for the first time. His voice was younger than his posture. You disappeared from every military contact point tied to your reserve exit. No forwarding file, no DoD callback, no via continuity beyond basic medical. That is not normal. Ava laughed once without humor. Neither was the last year I served. Holloway stepped in before the room could tilt further. Am I correct in understanding that you are not here to arrest one of my surgeons? Donovan turned to him. At this moment, no. At this moment, Holloway repeated. It depends what we find. Ava felt a flash of anger so clean it steadied her. You found me working an overnight trauma shift. That should help narrow your theory set. Cole's jaw tightened. Donovan, to her credit, did not flinch. Captain Blake, your record contains classified elements. When a person with that record changes names informally and enters a trauma center without fully closing prior status, we are obligated to determine whether the gap is administrative, psychological, or operational. Operational, Ava repeated. You think I am compromised. We have to rule it out. Holloway's voice dropped a degree colder. She has spent the last 7 hours saving lives in this hospital. Donovan did not look away from Ava. That is relevant. It is not conclusive. The fluorescent light in the office buzzed softly. Beyond the closed door, a cart rolled past in the hall and faded. The hospital was waking into dawn while this room remained suspended somewhere outside time. Ava uncrossed her arms. The fatigue in them had become a deep interior burn. Ask what you came to ask. Donovan studied her face as if deciding where to cut. Why did you leave without finalizing the process? Ava said nothing. Why did you stop using Blake and start using Carter? Still nothing. Cole opened a paper folder this time instead of the tablet. Your military attending evaluations describe you as unusually effective under mass casualty conditions, highly independent and resistant to authority that lacks field relevance. Holloway made the smallest possible sound through his nose. Cole continued. There is also a notation attached to your medical transition request indicating acute moral injury following an incident at Forward Operating Base Mercer in Kandahar Province. The name hit Ava harder than she expected, not because of the base, because of the bureaucratic neatness of moral injury. 2 words broad enough to cover a crater and small enough to fit in a margin. Holloway's attention sharpened. What incident? Donovan glanced at Cole, then back to Ava. The sealed portion. Ava's eyes stayed on the tablet. You already know enough to be standing in this office. We know what was filed, Donovan said. Not what it cost. Something in her tone was quieter than before. Not gentler, more human. Sometimes that was worse. Ava looked at Holloway then. He stood behind the desk with both hands braced against the wood the chief of trauma surgery stripped of distance at last waiting, not for gossip or explanation, but for a structure he could place around the violence of the person in front of him. He had spent the whole night trying to decide what she meant. Here was the answer he wanted, and she hated him a little for being present to receive it. Mortars hit the surgical compound, she said. No one moved. We had 11 wounded already in the treatment tents. 2 Rangers open on tables, 1 with abdominal vascular trauma, 1 with thoracic shrapnel and tension physiology. Then the first round landed near the perimeter and they started bringing in civilians from the contractor housing area. Her voice had gone flat, controlled by force rather than calm. 6 children. Local. All alive on arrival. Multiple fragment injuries. Holloway lowered himself slowly into the chair behind the desk, not because he meant to sit, but because his body stopped asking permission. Ava kept going. The protocol in that environment was clear. If surgery is in progress on critical military personnel, you do not abandon the table unless the entire structure is compromised. I had 2 patients already open. I had 1 other surgeon concussed by blast pressure and a medic trying to ventilate by hand because the backup generator had failed. I made the call to finish the 2 Rangers first. The office had become so quiet she could hear the faint whine of the radiator under the window. Cole looked down at the folder. Donovan did not, and the children. Holloway said, his voice low. Ava looked at the wall behind him instead of at any of their faces. By the time I got to them, 4 were gone. 2 still had pulses. I saved those 2 for almost 20 minutes longer than they deserved because I was trying to reverse time with my hands. No one interrupted. The Rangers lived, she said. All 6 children should have had better odds than they did. 4 were buried because I followed the right order in the wrong world. Her jaw tightened. She could feel her pulse behind her eyes now. Hard and heavy, the beginning of the old flood she had kept dammed through years of work and sleep so thin it barely counted. That answer your question about the name change. Cole shifted in his chair, suddenly looking younger than before. Donovan's face did not change, but something in her gaze did. Holloway sat very still. You left because of that. I left because after enough people call you a hero for making a choice that kills children, the word becomes uninhabitable. The sentence hung in the room like smoke. No one tried to clean it up. Donovan reached for the tablet and turned it toward Ava. A declassified report sat open on the screen, dense blocks of text broken by blacked-out lines and map coordinates. This was released to a limited review channel. 6 months ago, she said. We confirmed the attack on FOB Mercer was facilitated by an embedded interpreter working with the Taliban. He supplied exact tent coordinates and rotation timing to the mortar team. The medical compound was the target. Ava looked at the report without taking it in at first. Donovan continued. It was not random shelling. It was planned to hit the triage and surgical tents during active operations. Holloway frowned. You are telling her she was deliberately set up? Yes. Ava took the tablet then. The text sharpened one line at a time. Intercepted communications. Placement. Timing. The interpreter, whose face she could barely remember because there had been too many names, too many voices, too many uniforms in the months before the strike. A paragraph noting probable intent to maximize casualties among medical staff and patients during high-occupancy operations. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the screen. For 2 years, she had replayed the sequence exactly the same way. 2 Rangers open. 6 children bleeding. The order chosen. The order paid for. She had built an entire second life around the certainty that whatever else had happened out there, the dead belonged partly to her. The report did not absolve choice. It rearranged blame. That was somehow harder to bear. Why was I never told, she asked. Donovan's answer came quietly. The investigation took 18 months and crossed multiple agencies. By the time the findings were cleared for release, you had already dropped off formal contact. Ava handed the tablet back before she cracked the screen with her grip. So you found me to close a file. We found you to verify you were alive, stable, and not compromised, Donovan said. And yes, to close the file properly. Cole slid a set of papers from the folder and placed them on Holloway's desk. Discharge completion. Reserve separation acknowledgement. Identity continuity forms. Dry, legal language waiting for a signature that had not existed in public for 2 years. Holloway looked from the forms to Ava. That is it. Cole nodded. For the administrative matter, yes. For the psychological one, Donovan added, there is no form. Ava almost smiled at that, but the emotion had nowhere to land. Donovan reached into her briefcase and placed a second folder beside the first. There is one other matter. A joint military and civilian trauma training initiative is under development through Defense Health and Federal Emergency Preparedness. Combat casualty protocols adapted for domestic mass casualty response. Your name came up before we ever located you in person. Ava stared at the folder as if it belonged to another room. I'm not going back, she said. This would not be a return to deployment, Donovan replied. It would be consultation and curriculum design. Teaching, system building. Why me? Donovan held her gaze. Because your outcomes are still studied in places where outcome usually means survival percentages and not mythology. Because officers who served with you asked us to find you if the paperwork ever surfaced. Because the medicine you practiced under those conditions should not die in those conditions. Holloway leaned back slightly in his chair, looking from one folder to the other, from the federal future being offered to the civilian past she was standing in. Ava looked at the forms instead. Her real name waited at the bottom line like an accusation and an amnesty at once. Rowan Elise Blake. She had not signed it in almost 2 years. The office door opened before anyone could say more. Jillian stepped in, then stopped when she saw the agents. Sorry, I can come back. What is it? Holloway asked. Lieutenant Briggs in ICU is awake enough to follow commands. He keeps asking for the surgeon from the trauma bay. Ava closed her eyes for one brief moment. Life did that. It continued asking things of you while the rest of you stood somewhere else entirely. Jillian looked at her and took in the room with one nurse's glance. She saw the papers. She saw Holloway's face. She saw Donovan and Cole and understood without understanding. "He can wait 10 minutes, she said. Ava opened her eyes. "No," she said, "he should not have to." She stepped to the desk. The pen Holloway offered her was heavy and expensive, the kind of pen men buy after enough years in offices to believe objects should carry weight. She held it over the first signature line. Her hand shook once barely. Fatigue. Adrenaline residue. Something older. Then she wrote the name in a clean, practiced hand. Rowan Blake. Not Carter, not a compromise. Just the truth. Cole collected the papers with visible care as if the signature itself completed some geometry inside the federal machine. Donovan did not move right away. "There are 2 men alive in Colorado and North Carolina, because you finished those surgeries in Kandahar," she said. "One of them has twin girls. The other just had a son. They asked that if we ever found you, we tell you they remember." Ava swallowed once, nothing more. Donovan stood. "My card is in the folder. Use it or do not." "But your status is closed, Captain," Dr. Ava said. A faint, almost smile touched Donovan's mouth. "Doctor." Cole gathered the rest of the file and rose as well. At the door he hesitated, then said, "For what it is worth, my sister is trauma nursing in Chicago. People like you are why she came home from overseas and kept doing the job." Ava looked at him and saw finally the shape inside the stiffness. Not suspicion alone. Family. They left. The office felt larger without them and much harder to breathe in. Holloway remained seated for several seconds after the door shut. Then he stood, came around the desk, and stopped across from her. "All night," he said quietly, "I thought I was looking at concealed competence. I was actually looking at a combat surgeon trying to pass as a first-year resident." Ava stared at the folders on his desk. "I never lied about my license." "No, you lied by scale." She almost argued, but she was too tired for elegance and too honest now for denial. "I came here because I needed a place where nobody was bleeding dirt into the wound," she said. "Where every decision was not made under mortar range. I needed civilian medicine to feel smaller." And did it? She thought of Bay 1, Daniel Reeve, gasping blue in Bay 5, Luis on the table under white light, Noah Briggs coding twice before dawn. "No," she said. Holloway let that sit between them. Then he surprised her. "We are going to have a separate conversation about disclosure credentialing and why the board let this through in the shape it did." His voice stayed measured. "But after what I saw tonight, there is one thing I am not going to do. I am not going to waste your skill by pretending it belongs at the bottom of a teaching hierarchy designed for people with 1/10 your operational judgment." Ava looked up at him. He held her gaze. "You should not be functioning as a supervised beginner." The words landed harder than praise. They carried structure, consequence, a future she had refused to imagine because imagining was the first step toward wanting. "I do not want special treatment," she said. "It is not special treatment to call expertise by its name." He glanced at the signed papers. "And it is not evasion anymore to ask what you intend to do with yours." Ava looked towards the window. Dawn had started to gray the glass beyond the administrative wing, faint and cold over the city. Somewhere below, an elevator bell chimed. A hospital day team was arriving. Coffee would be brewing in break rooms. Families would be waking in plastic chairs beside beds where the night had either spared them or not. "I intend to check on my patients," she said. A different, almost smile crossed Holloway's face, then brief and worn and more respectful than anything he had said to her since she arrived. "That sounds like you." He stepped aside and opened the office door. Ava picked up neither folder. She left them where they were for the moment and walked back into the corridor with the exhaustion of 2 years sitting differently inside her than it had an hour earlier. Not lighter, not gone, just no longer shapeless. Down the hall, the first edge of morning touched the windows. She turned toward the ICU. The unit was quieter than the trauma floor, but it was never truly quiet. Ventilators breathed in patient rhythms. Infusion pumps clicked softly. Monitors cast green and amber light across dim rooms where night had not fully let go. The air smelled like antiseptic-warmed plastic, and the faint metallic trace that follows serious injury no matter how often the floors are cleaned. Ava walked past the nurse's station with her scrub cap in one hand and a fatigue so deep it had begun to feel strangely clean. Not numb, not even calm. Just stripped down to what remained when adrenaline and secrecy had both burned off. Lieutenant Noah Briggs was awake when she stepped into his room. He looked smaller, without the violence of the trauma bay around him. His chest was wrapped. Tubes and lines still tethered him to half a dozen machines, but his eyes were clear, and that clarity carried its own weight. A military policeman stood near the window in wrinkled dress blues, likely a friend or unit escort who had refused to leave. He straightened when Ava entered, then saw the look on Briggs's face and quietly stepped out to give them the room. Briggs swallowed before speaking. His voice came rough from the tube that had been in earlier. "They said you operated on me twice." Ava moved to the monitor and checked the rhythm. Stronger now, more regular. There was some repair involved. His mouth shifted, not quite a smile. "That sounds smaller than it feels. You are alive. That is the useful part." He watched her for a moment. "Staff Sergeant Mercer was in here. He said I should thank you properly." Ava adjusted a line. "Rest is the proper way to thank any trauma surgeon." Briggs let out the smallest breath that could pass for a laugh. Then his expression changed. "My wife is 7 months pregnant." Ava looked at him. "I did not know if I was going to make it through the night," he said. "Now I am lying here thinking about a crib I never finished building." He blinked hard once and stared at the ceiling until the moisture in his eyes went nowhere. "I just need you to know I understand what you gave back to me." The words landed somewhere under Ava's ribs in that guarded place where gratitude always met ghosts before it reached her. "You still have to do the hard part," she said quietly. "You have to heal. You have to go home. You have to build the crib." His eyes came back to hers. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him until he corrected himself. "Yes, doctor." That was better. When she stepped out into the corridor, the military policeman waiting by the window gave her a look that carried recognition without intrusion. He had heard enough, or maybe Mercer had already told him more than he should have. Either way, he did not speak. He only put one hand briefly over his heart in a gesture so old and quiet it broke something open in her more effectively than praise ever could. She nodded once and kept walking. Luis Ortega was 2 rooms down. His wife had arrived during surgery and now sat curled in a chair beside his bed, with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee gone cold. Her mascara had run and dried in faint gray tracks beneath her eyes. She looked up so fast when Ava entered that the cup nearly slipped from her grip. "Doctor." Luis was awake enough to turn his head, though pain still sat heavily in the corners of his mouth. He looked less like a dying man now, and more like a young father who had been hit too hard by the world and was not yet done with it. Ava checked the dressing near the clavicle, then the chest tube output, then the pulse oximeter. Marisol rose before Ava could stop her and pulled her into a fierce, unsteady hug. For half a second, Ava froze. Physical gratitude had always startled her more than blood did. Then she stood still and let the woman hold on. "Thank you," Marisol whispered. "They told me he had steel in his chest. They told me nobody could get there in time." Ava stepped back gently. "He lost a lot of blood, but the repair is holding." Luis reached for his wife's wrist and kept hold of it as if touch itself might keep both of them moored. "You told me I was not dying here," he said. "I was trying to motivate you." He smiled despite the pain. It worked. There were crayons on the tray table near the window. Not from Luis, but from the pediatric supplies every ICU kept, because Injury and family did not respect adult wards. One of his daughters must have come briefly before being taken home. A folded paper lay beside them with a drawing in thick red and blue lines. A square building. Rain. An ambulance. A stick figure in blue standing next to a taller stick figure in a hard hat. On the top, in careful, uneven letters, someone had written, "Thank you for fixing Daddy." Ava looked at it only once, because a second look might have lingered too long. She left the room before the emotion inside it became unbearable. The corridor outside the ICU windows had begun to fill with mourning. Baltimore spread pale and damp beyond the glass rooftops, slick from rain, the harbor hidden under low cloud. Shift change murmured around the station. New nurses arrived carrying T-clipped keys and the practiced faces of people entering other people's worst days before sunrise. Elena found Ava there. She had changed into clean scrubs, though the weariness in her face made it clear that clean fabric solved very little. 2 paper cups of coffee steamed in her hands. "I brought the stronger one," she said. Ava accepted it. For a while, they stood side by side at the window without speaking. Traffic moved in thin silver lines far below. The city was beginning again, as if the night had not nearly torn itself open in multiple places. Ava said after a moment, "You should hear this from me before it mutates in the retelling." Elena glanced at her. That would be a refreshing hospital first. Ava held the coffee between both hands and let the heat bite into her skin. "My name is Rowan Blake. Ava Carter is legal enough to function and incomplete enough to hide inside. I served as an Army surgeon attached to Ranger operations. 4 deployments. Most of what matters happened in places I do not enjoy remembering." Elena listened without interruption. "I came here because I wanted civilian medicine to feel separate from all of that," Ava said. "I wanted to start low enough that nobody would ask me to be who I had been. I thought if I worked quietly enough, maybe the skill would stay attached to the work and not to the story." Elena stared out at the harbor for a moment before answering. "And did it. Number." She nodded once, unsurprised. No, it did not. The corner of Ava's mouth shifted almost a smile. Elena sipped her coffee. "I was angry for about 20 minutes. That seems efficient. I am a surgeon. I schedule emotions when possible." She turned then and met Ava's eyes directly. "Then I watched you bring back a man who should have died in Bay 4 and a second one who definitely would have if Holloway kept chasing the wrong source." After that, anger felt self-indulgent. Ava looked down at her cup. "You have a right to it. I have a right to accurate information in my operating room. That part stands." Elena's expression softened just enough to make the next words harder to absorb. "I also think you were trying to survive. Those 2 things can exist together." Ava breathed in once and let it out slowly. Elena bumped her shoulder lightly. "Also, for the record, your bedside manner is much better than Connor's, so your crimes are balanced." That time Ava did laugh, brief and quiet, but real. Holloway appeared at the end of the corridor, then jacket-off tie loosened, looking more human than she had ever seen him. He paused when he saw them, then continued forward with the folder in one hand. "Elena, I need 10 minutes." Elena took the hint at once. "I am going to find carbohydrates before I make a dangerous choice with a scalpel." She left them with her coffee still half full. Holloway stood beside Ava at the window. Morning light found the fatigue in his face and made him look older, though not weaker. More honest, perhaps. "I spoke with the chief medical officer in the board chair," he said. Ava turned toward him. That was fast. "It was a long night." He handed her the folder. "Read it before you refuse." Inside was not a reprimand, not an inquiry, not a notice of suspension. It was an offer. Interim trauma. Attending privileges under expedited review. Modified residency equivalency. Direct oversight authority in mass casualty situations pending formal credential conversion. Teaching responsibilities to begin immediately. Military surgical case logs to be evaluated for civilian advancement credit through a special review panel. Ava read it twice to make sure fatigue had not changed the words. "This is not possible. It is bureaucratically offensive," Holloway said. "Which means I had to call in 3 favors and 1 threat." "But yes, it is possible." She looked up at him. "You are promoting me 1 shift after learning I lied by omission. I am correcting a classification error." His voice stayed flat but not unkind. "You should have disclosed more. We will deal with that. But I watched you save 4 people last night under conditions that turned half this hospital into triage. You do not belong in a track built for someone learning how to control a wound for the first time." Ava turned another page. Her real name was typed there in black ink, waiting for a decision she had not planned to face this soon. "Holloway. Michael will do if you are going to argue with me." She looked at him fully then. It was the first time he had offered even that small step down from hierarchy. "I do not know how to do this without becoming a spectacle," she said. "Then do what you did last night. Keep your hand steady and let everyone else catch up." He leaned one shoulder against the glass. "Medicine is full of people who confuse story with competence. I am not interested in your legend. I am interested in your judgment, which is terrifyingly good." The compliment would have sounded easier from almost anyone else. From him, it struck like a clinical finding. He went on. "There is another reason for the offer. We are not as prepared as we pretend to be. Not for multiple simultaneous trauma patterns, not for collapse scenes, not for chest injuries that do not read like textbook diagrams. You can change that." Ava looked back down at the folder. The old instinct, the one that always searched for the exit, stirred again. Leave before this becomes expectation. Leave before the next loss turns the room against you. Leave before your name grows loud enough to become unlivable. But another instinct existed beneath it. Older, cleaner, the one that moved toward the wound because someone had to. She closed the folder. "I would need conditions," she said. Holloway's brows rose slightly. "Of course you would. Trauma. Simulation training revised from the ground up. Mass casualty drills that do not pretend order arrives on time. Better decision support for junior residents who notice things before attendings do. No one gets dismissed for pattern recognition because their paperwork is thinner than their superior's confidence." He watched her for a second, then nodded once. "Agreed. And I choose my teaching team." "That depends who you choose." "Elena. Done." She considered that. "Jillian, in simulation design." "Also done." Connor not allowed within 10 feet of curriculum. For the first time since dawn broke, Holloway smiled without restraint. It transformed his face in a way that startled her. "I can negotiate that clause," he said. The smile left almost immediately, but the warmth of it lingered in the space between them. "Take the day. Sleep. Then come back tomorrow and tell me whether you sign." Ava looked at the folder in her hands. "You are very sure I will?" "No," he said. "I am very sure you should." He left her there with the city brightening beyond the glass. Ava did not go home immediately. She went downstairs first. On the trauma floor, the worst of the night had already been absorbed into paperwork handoff reports and the brutal efficiency with which hospitals turn catastrophe into charted sequence. Connor was at the station dictating a note with bloodshot eyes and none of his usual swagger. He looked up when Ava passed and then stood so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall. "I heard," he said. That could have meant anything. Her name, the agents, the surgery, all of it. Ava waited. He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "About Bay 1. Earlier. I should not have made that comment." She held his gaze long enough that he had to stay inside the discomfort. "No, you should not have." He nodded, once chastened in a way that suggested he might finally become teachable. At the far end of the desk, Jillian was pinning a child's crayon drawing to the inside of a cabinet door with hospital tape. The same one from Luis's room, or maybe another. This one showed a blue figure standing between an ambulance and a heart drawn bigger than the person. Jillian saw Ava looking and shrugged lightly. Night shift art gallery, she said. Helps with perspective. Ava nodded. When she finally stepped out of St. Catherine's just after 8, the rain had stopped. The city smelled washed and metallic. Commuters moved along the sidewalks with umbrellas folded under their arms, coffee in hand, unaware that less than an hour earlier, blood had been pouring through trauma bays above them, and federal agents had stood in an office asking for a name Ava had nearly forgotten how to carry. She did not go far. Her apartment was 12 blocks away in a brick building above a corner pharmacy. Small, sparse, easy to leave if leaving became necessary. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stood for a moment in the quiet. There were only a few personal things in the place. A lamp by the couch, a stack of trauma journals on the table, running shoes by the radiator. One cardboard box in the bedroom closet she had never fully unpacked because unpacking had felt too much like faith. She pulled the box out and set it on the bed. Inside were the pieces of the life she had refused to arrange. Old challenge coins, a folded uniform patch, a photograph from a surgical tent with half the faces turned away from the camera, a commendation citation she had never framed. On the bottom sat a metal name tape wrapped in tissue paper. Blake. She held it in her palm for a long time. Then she set it on the dresser where she could see it without hiding it, and without turning it into an altar. She slept for 5 hours and dreamt of neither mortar fire nor dead children nor fluorescent hallways. Just darkness. Deep and unbroken. When she returned to the hospital that evening, she came in through the front entrance with the folder under one arm and her real name signed on the acceptance line. The badge office printed a temporary ID while she waited. Dr. Rowan Blake. The letters looked strange in black on white plastic. Not because they were wrong, because they were visible. Elena met her outside the sim lab on the second floor, arms full of airway mannequins and a dry erase marker tucked behind one ear. "You look terrible," Elena said. "I slept. Then I am afraid to see you tired." Ava held up the new badge. Elena's eyes flicked to it and then back to her face. No ceremony. No speech. Just a quiet, satisfied nod. Good. Inside the sim lab, Jillian had already rearranged the room into a rough trauma scenario. Stretchers, monitors, mock blood packs, whiteboards. Holloway stood at the back, speaking with 2 attendings from emergency medicine, who looked skeptical in the way all established physicians look 10 minutes before they are forced to admit they are curious. Ava stepped into the center of the room and set her folder on the table. The chatter faded. She looked at the residents gathering along the walls. Connor among them. 3 interns. 2 senior nurses. Elena at her side. Holloway in the rear with his arms folded. Faces from the night before, and faces who had only heard fragments. When systems fail, she said people do not rise to the level of their intentions. They fall to the level of their training. The room held still. She placed one hand on the nearest stretcher. "So, we are going to train for the moment when the room gets loud the chart is wrong. The first answer fails and somebody still has to decide. We are going to train until speed is not panic and judgment is not ego. We are going to train until the patient in front of you matters more than the hierarchy behind you." No one moved. Then Elena took the marker from behind her ear and tossed it gently onto the table. "Where do you want us to start?" she asked. Ava looked around the room, at the people, the equipment, the bright washed light of the hospital continuing all around them, and for the first time in years, the answer came without fracture. "Here," she said, "we start here."